and welcome to Future of Work. I'm your host, Claudia Virlanuta, and today I would like to introduce you to my guest, Molly Bales. Molly is a storage development manager at Recurrent Energy, where she has developed utility-scale solar and storage projects across the United States, across the Eastern United States more specifically. Prior to Recurrent, Molly co-founded Adapt Intelligence, a startup with a system of sensors and analytics to plan and manage office spaces. She led sales and marketing efforts at Adapt Intelligence, and she also has energy projects development experience from her time at Harvest Power, which is a Boston area organics recycling company and developer of anaerobic digestion facilities. As the company grew from 13 employees to over 600 during Molly's time there, she held a variety of roles, including business development, marketing, project management, and sales. Molly received her MBA from the MIT Sloan School of Management with a focus on energy, sustainability, and entrepreneurship. And she also holds a bachelor's degree from Harvard University, where she majored in history of science with a subfield in earth and planetary sciences. Molly, thanks so much for joining me on the show today and welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Definitely. So actually, I am super curious to hear about the work that you're doing at Recurrent Energy and the work that Recurrent Energy is doing and just the state of renewable energy in general, since it is a very, very big and important topic nowadays. And actually, to get the conversation started, first and foremost, I was hoping that you'd share with us, since this is a show about learning, what's the last thing that you learned that got you really, really excited, and why is that?
Sure. It's so funny. The energy industry can get very technical very quickly, and I will do my best not to dig too much into the weeds. So feel free to stop me if I'm using jargon that I shouldn't and that sort of thing. But yeah, I'll just explain some background real quick in terms of the work that I do. So as a developer at Recurrent, I help develop solar plus storage and also standalone storage projects in 3 different markets in the US: ERCOT, PJM, and MISO. So those are, ERCOT is Texas, MISO is the Midwest, and then PJM is, you can think of as Eastern Seaboard. It's essentially from North Carolina, and then it goes up north and heads over basically to Ohio, roughly. So in terms of those markets, that's where I focus. And as a developer, you end up going super in depth into various aspects of how you develop project with permitting, site control, the interconnection, so that's the process of connecting to the grid, and then ultimately your project sale process and financing, things of that nature. So the type of things that I get excited about are probably things that other people may not get excited about, but I'll give you one example and see if it makes any sense to you. So recently, you may have followed the news about in ERCOT, so in Texas, the electric grid suffered a major setback. We had major outages during February, during that winter storm. It was a very interesting time to be a member of the renewable energy industry while all of that went down. And there's been a lot of industry discussion, a lot of policy discussion at the state level about what do we do about this? How do we prevent this level of outages happening in the future? There are a lot of different things that can be addressed. One thing that I found really interesting that, again, is probably into the weeds for a lot of people, but in storage, one of the cool things about it is that a battery can perform lots of different grid services. So you have to think about, as a developer, what is this battery going to do? What is it useful for? And then think about, what is that value? And is that value actually recognized in the market? Can I actually make money from it as you're building the project? So one of the revenue streams that you can pursue that it doesn't come up quite that often yet is called Black Start. So this is a type of revenue stream where or a service, and it can turn into a revenue stream, where if the grid goes completely down and then you have to help the plants that need to get everybody back online, they need power themselves. So if you have a major outage across a huge portion of the grid, you end up with this problem, which is that, well, how do you start up the plants that can't start up, and then they need to start up to get the whole grid going, right?
Right.
So there are these special Black Start generators who are responsible for that. So in the event of a huge grid outage, those are the facilities that are responsible. In the past, it's been very hush-hush, which even which facilities those are. It's not greatly publicized because it's actually a matter of national security.
Right.
But something that's interesting on the storage front is now we're reconsidering the possibility for batteries to provide black start. So the ability for a battery or another form of energy storage to have enough energy that if the entire grid goes down, it could be batteries that actually bring the other generators up to speed and end up restarting the entire grid after a massive grid outage. So I thought that was pretty exciting. It hasn't fully developed yet. We have to see whether they're offering enough money for batteries to do that. And there's some regulatory hurdles, but it's stuff like that that's pretty interesting. Things are changing all the time in the energy storage world. And we continue to find ways that batteries can add value or energy storage can add value. And it's just a matter of kind of getting policymakers and other stakeholders understanding of that so that energy storage can actually perform all of the functions that it could theoretically perform.
That sounds really fascinating, actually. And it's funny that you mentioned that too, because relative to the recent troubles in Texas, I remember seeing some news headlines that were blaming renewable energy for the downfall. And it really sounds like that was kind of like the fallback, not really the...
Yeah, unfortunately, there was a lot of mischaracterization of what happened during that storm. In fact, if you look at the data, it's quite clear that it was actually natural gas generators that went down.
Right.
And it was not, there was a tiny bit of wind that went down, but not at the level that actually caused the problem. And you can correlate the natural gas generators when they went down and then when we had this massive outage. So it's pretty cut and dry from a data perspective. And I think definitely some politicians try to throw it around and blame it on renewables. And we are still up against that from a legislative perspective, hoping that people will see their way and look at that data and make the right adjustments in the aftermath of the crisis.
Yeah, it's crazy how it happens, right? Because when it comes, obviously, this is a politics thing, right? When it comes to something like what happened in Texas, you can use renewables as a scapegoat, and then the rest of the time, hey, look, renewables, it's cool. So actually, you mentioned data a lot, and that's exciting because this is what we're about, and this is what I personally think that the future of work in many industries is dealing with. I think there is very important. So in terms of renewable energy, how central is data to your work? And more importantly, how well do you think it's used? It's one of those things that pretty much everybody working need to be conversant with, or is it more of an incidental that some people need?
Yeah, I mean, the use of data flows through the entire development process and operations process. And there are ways that we're good at data, and there are other ways that we're not surprisingly. I think as developers, we are always on the hunt for the best data we can find. And we do run into issues where, unfortunately, sometimes the data sources that we have are just not strong enough. We are making a massive change in terms of how we run the grid. And we are, as developers and operators of renewable energy, looking for way more granular levels of data. So we want to get down to the electric node level of understanding the pricing differences, what's happening at these very specific points throughout the entire grid. And sometimes it's hard to get those pinpoints of data correct. It's also can be difficult even figuring out, believe it or not, where on a map some things are. The data that you try to pull is a lot of times it's pretty messy and it's not standardized. So there's a lot of room for improvement there in terms of the raw data sources that we have to pull from. So I do hope that improves over time. But I would say throughout that, we're obviously I work actually in our origination and structuring team. So I work a lot on how we contract our facilities and how we get paid for the energy that we're producing. And for that, we are scouring for all types of data, trying to understand what is it worth to someone to contract with us for this energy, but also what is it worth if we decide to just go to the liquid market and go to one of what we call ISOs, independent system operators. Those independent system operators set up these liquid markets. And so we can play directly in those liquid markets. So that's us being merchant as a facility as opposed to being contracted. And there can be hybrid forms there. And for that, you have to have a really great understanding of what is going on in the market, because you yourself are actually an active energy trader if you decide to play on the market directly. So that becomes really crucial. In storage work in particular, the data becomes that much more crucial because, as I was kind of mentioning before, there are a variety of grid services that storage can provide, but a battery can't necessarily do them all at once. So you have to decide this could be 5-minute increments. You're talking 5-minute increments over the course of a facility that could run 20 to 40 years. You have to get down to that level and in real time decide, do I want to charge my battery right now? Do I want to discharge my battery? If I'm discharging my battery, what grid service am I performing? And there are a variety of different ones you could do. So you need to know what's my best option. And then on top of that, you have to keep in mind, you have to keep energy in your battery in order to be able to discharge and actually get onto the grid and perform services. So there's an opportunity cost related to using your energy at any given time. That gets incredibly complex. And you can imagine there's lots of PhDs who do lots of things around that topic. So understanding that data is incredibly important for optimizing revenues for storage, but really for energy, for any energy facility that is playing in the liquid energy market.
All of that is really, really cool because it sounds to me, Molly, that the data question doesn't just apply to how do renewable energy companies and storage companies in your case use it, but it also applies to how they reveal it to their clients, right? Because it sounds like the clients themselves also need access to it. Is that the case?
Well, there's definitely, from a communication standpoint, you do have to be able to distill down all of what's going on in the market and then be able to communicate that to your potential client, your customer who would be buying your energy. And then there's also utilities. So if you are selling, you could be selling your project to a utility for them to own, or just if you're kind of working with the utility, their ability to look at data can be limited in some cases even by computer systems, because this stuff gets so complicated. You actually need to have enough data center storage to be able to perform various computations. So it is important for counterparties or just various stakeholders to be able to speak the same language. And you can only do that if you really are able to not only communicate it well, but actually have the technical capabilities for people to receive that data and to play with it themselves to understand the mechanics.
Right. And it comes down to having those skills to be able to do that, in-house. So I'm just curious, your data sources, you mentioned that a lot of the data that you work with is just very messy. Where do you get data from? So I'm guessing that in storage, you probably get a good amount of logs from storage batteries, from storage systems or something like that.
You could, if you are a company that has a history of operating, obviously you would rely on your own previous data. In terms of other data sets that may or may not be available, where we really get a lot of our data from is from the ISOs, the independent system operators, who they're the ones kind of running the grid on a day-to-day basis in terms of being the intermediary between buyers and sellers of energy. They're the ones creating that market. And so they do provide a lot of data to companies just publicly and for companies like us that want to connect to the grid so that we can actually figure things out. So each independent system operator, each ISO, so Texas has its own, for instance, that entity, ERCOT, provides a huge data set for companies like mine to interface with, to learn from. And they will vary, the types of data sets that are available, depending on the market that you're in. So if you're in Texas, or you're in California, or you're in New York, those are going to be different data sets that are available from the independent system operators. There's also a whole other set to this, which is development. So when we're developing energy facilities, yes, we're interacting with the energy market and we need energy data, and we'll pull that. We also pull from like Bloomberg or like WoodMac. These are kind of big companies that have become authorities in terms of the data that they're scraping, and we do use that. But there's also all the land data that you need to understand. So we work in Google Earth a lot, believe it or not. It still works very well as kind of a level setting software program for various people to work with. And you have all these layers of data of what is the contour, so what's the topography of a piece of land, where are the transmission lines, where are the substations located, what voltage are they? Are there wetlands? Are there other kind of jurisdictional issues we need to be aware of. So you're actually looking at tons of layers of GIS data on top of kind of the energy market piece of what we do.
That sounds really fascinating, actually. It sounds like data is kind of at the core of the industry. It sounds like you're relying a lot on the folks that you work with having these skills. What does the talent situation look like in renewable energy? Are you able to source the right kind of talent that you're looking for, or is that a struggle, especially nowadays?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the industry is growing really fast, and that
Mhm.
not surprisingly puts a lot of pressure in terms of talent acquisition. That can be tough in that we just can't fill the pipeline with enough people. And obviously, the path of least resistance as a company is to hire people who've already done what you want them to do. That
Right.
in a lot of cases doesn't exist. You do need to train people and bring them up in the industry. So there's a big uptake of people into this industry, and a lot of people who are switching into this industry, which is great. Sure, there are plenty of people who are interested in this industry, but in terms of people who have experience, it can be a little challenging, admittedly, to get all of the talent that you need in this kind of business.
And specifically, what kind of talent and skills are you looking for? So, for example, let's say that perhaps some of our viewers who are just looking to break into the industry, perhaps let's say they don't have industry experience. What kinds of skills are you looking for specifically, both strictly technical as well as industry related?
Sure. It's funny because the energy industry is so broad, and there's even within development, there's tons of different skills required. So the good news there is that there's a big variety of things we're looking for, which is good news for people who are interested. In a role like mine, I mean, I spend a lot of time doing analytical work. I mean, I really just end up a ton of time spent in Excel. I am also doing a lot of outreach work, a lot of business development, so a lot of interfacing with different people, sales skills, that sort of thing, communications. So having kind of both of those skill sets, I think, is really important. And in that sense, it's kind of similar to a kind of a well-rounded commercial person in terms of what's required if you're on the development team, or if you're in origination and structuring. If you're in project finance, also, I think it's kind of similar ideas there, with varying degrees of kind of the finance background required for those roles. Then there's a whole set of technical roles. I mean, we have development engineers, we have a procurement team that would interface with EPC contractors. So that would be, you really need to understand some civil engineering, for instance. So that's an element. We have permitting experts, so people who just have a deep knowledge in the various permits that are required to get things done and get them approved. And then if you go outside of that, and if you're not a developer and you're an owner, that can be people who are comfortable on kind of budgets and understanding profit and loss and being able to have operational experience. So that becomes relevant if you're a type of company that not only develops but also owns and operates. So there's a huge range there.
Got it. Yeah. Specifically, what we're talking about, data in particular, like you said, the analytical skills in terms of Excel and being able to work with GIS data. So some Python there probably.
Yes, definitely some Python involved.
Yeah, those are useful things. So within the industry as a whole, what do you think is coming down the pipe for the industry? What's the future of work in renewable energy?
Sure. So, I mean, I think it's been kind of interesting in terms of our industry that, like I said, we are growing. I do think there is some consolidation going on, which is interesting, of a lot of entities. So that's kind of an interesting trend, for better or for worse. I think there's definitely on the data side, there's certainly startups and people doing kind of interesting analytical things. There's still room for tools for us to do our work better. So that's definitely changing and heading forward. I think a lot of the trends that we see in our industry, though, are similar to other industries. I mean, certainly post-COVID, and actually even pre-COVID, it's an industry that's very comfortable with remote work. If you're a developer, you're going on to customer sites all the time. You need to stay in touch with people while you're on the road. So it's just natural that we have people who work remotely who aren't necessarily in one of our main offices. And that's perfectly okay, because you have to trust your teammates to get their work done while they're on the road. So why wouldn't you trust them working from home? It's just kind of something that we're comfortable with. And so, but I think with COVID, obviously, things changed dramatically, and people got even more out of the office. And I think that's a big change. And I don't see us going fully back.
Yeah, that's really neat, actually. I mean, a lot of industries out there are, a lot of people clamoring in other industries are clamoring to retain remote work and to be able to work remotely. So that sounds like a good way to attract talent in the industry. We're remote by definition.
Yeah, I mean, we already had to have that skill because you're building facilities that are in physical places, right? So you have to get to them.
Right, and that's an asset. Yeah. So going back to the data question, how do you think the industry, the renewable energy industry as a whole, could use data better? What are some obstacles that are standing in the way of the industry using its data assets and the third-party data assets that it acquires better or more efficiently?
Sure. I mean, I think some of it, and I think I might have alluded to this earlier, is those original data sources, getting those to be standardized and getting them to be correct. I mean, in some cases, I have to work with, believe it or not, we have to use PowerFlow software to figure out where a substation even is if we're not physically
What's
there.
PowerFlow?
Yeah, so PowerFlow software would be like a way of understanding how electrons are flowing throughout the grid. And so that's something that a few members of our team use, that kind of software. And so because they have kind of the big kind of powerful software, they can figure out and trace the place for a substation, for instance. But for those of us who are in development, based on the data sources that we may be getting directly from the market itself, the ISO, we may not be able to figure out where it is. And so that seems so simple, right? Just tell me where the substation is. But apparently the coordinates are not correct, or something has happened where it isn't correct, and you can't always get really scrub data.
Right.
So that's definitely a problem. And some of it's nomenclature. So calling something a node or a substation, whether it's a node or a substation, has a different name, that's very confusing. And so kind of being able to clean up those data sets and give people who are developing facilities clean enough data to work with would be super helpful.
So basically, cleaner data from the very source and a standardization of the field names and things like that, probably.
Right.
Like standard data names.
Yes, I think that's really crucial. I do think you can go deep on the other end of things and say, like, we're going to figure this out and go super in depth in the energy market. And you can do forward curves of forecasting what you think the energy pricing is going to be and all this kind of stuff. And then you can get deep into optimization of facilities. And again, I mean, that's something that plenty of PhDs are working on, that I think will get even smarter. And I think, I'm sure you would appreciate that there can be use of AI in that context, and we can get even better about that and really optimize and get our grid to be functioning as best it can. And I think that's highly relevant. But it is funny. I mean, some of the low-hanging fruit is just clean data, which sounds like it might be a small ask, but it's moves a lot. It's moving a lot of bureaucratic institutions in a way that can be challenging. So
interesting. Whose court is the ball in terms of cleaner data?
Yeah, some of it might be with utilities. Some of it might be with these independent system operators, who are these entities regulating the market. In some cases, and I won't name a name, but I know of one of the ISOs that still has their computer system running on like Windows 2000. So they're 20 years behind, and they're still doing that. And there's a particular one of mine who is not complying with what should really be required to do what they should be doing. So having a computer system that's 20 years old is not ideal, particularly given that things are only getting more complex. So you need to getting better and better, not being that far out of date. So it's not the sexy answer that you might be looking for, but even just those basics are very helpful. And we are working with quasi-governmental entities and just kind of continuing to push them along. And to the extent that can continue to be a productive dialogue between more of kind of the governmental realm and the policy realm and with the private sector, I mean, I think that's crucial for the private sector to really be unleashed to solve the problems that we have around renewable energy and ultimately climate change.
Right. So it's kind of like a teamwork battle, so to speak. Yeah, to get all these things together. So you mentioned AI, and speaking of AI, what's the status right now? Is there any AI or machine learning being used in renewable energy and in storage? And if not, what's on the roadmap? What can we expect to see in the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years?
Sure. I mean, I would say a big one, and I think I've already kind of alluded to it, is revenue stream optimization. So really deciding in real time, within seconds, if not, minutes, if not seconds, what function a battery should be performing and what maximizes revenue and presumably value for everyone who wants to benefit from energy. I think that's a huge area where that kind of those quick calculations, that ability to understand what is going to be optimal and continue to make those decisions and run plants better is a huge part of having a sustainable grid and really being able to incorporate storage into the grid, which is a crucial piece for unleashing renewable energy.
Right. And how far away do you think that is in terms of actually seeing it implemented?
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, there are startups that are working on that kind of thing. It's understandably more difficult for incumbents to kind of have those skills in-house. So we usually see them coming out in younger companies that are grappling with these problems. I think it takes a little while in that, frankly, these are huge facilities. They cost a lot. You always want to put debt on those facilities. That means that you need to get lenders comfortable with how the facility might need to be operated. And that may include a young company that has done a brilliant job optimizing revenue streams, but doesn't have any credit, right? So you can end up in a situation where it takes a little while to get those algorithms really implemented in a way that's useful. But I do think, fortunately, there are owner operators, and some of them are doing work off of their balance sheet. So if they don't require outside finances, then they can get away with implementing new things. So in a lot of cases, that's where we see a lot of innovation being incorporated. So long story short, I would say it's happening. Those technologies are being implemented. And I think it's just getting better and better, and it needs more time to establish credibility and things like that. So it's already happening. And I think over the next 5 to 10 years, we'll certainly see that kind of thing be implemented and be really commonplace, would be my expectation.
Yeah, it sounds to me actually that there are a lot of similarities between the renewable energy and the energy industry in general and the finance industry. And it sounds like you guys are struggling with similar issues in terms of legacy systems and regulation that's putting the brakes on the type of innovation that I think everybody would like to see tried out.
Absolutely. I mean, it is interesting too, another parallel in terms of the work that we do in origination structuring. And so ultimately finding customers for these products, or actually, I should say more on the project finance side, we're ultimately looking for people to buy our projects.
Right.
And that's a situation where we think a lot about what is the parallel of our project? What does it offer? And you can think of it as an annuity. So a renewable energy project that has a power purchase agreement has a guaranteed amount of income per year based on the contract. And so you're thinking of that finance parallel because you have to ultimately be working with hedge funds and other groups like that who ultimately, in a lot of cases, will own those facilities. And so there's the parallel. Absolutely, you're right in terms of we are at an intersection of policy and private sector, and that means that things can get dicey sometimes, and you just need a little bit more time to make adjustments and get things to work properly. But even so, we also have to kind of think in a little bit like people who are in the finance industry to be able to make these projects come about.
Right. It sounds like also from a talent perspective, it sounds like folks with experience in finance and in finance analytics, I think would be probably a good fit.
Yeah, I agree with
within
that.
the renewables energy. Yeah. Cool. So on the topic of talent, staying on the topic of skills and talent, how important would you say it is for professionals who are considering going into the renewable energy industry in the near future or in the further future? How important is it for them to be data savvy and to be able to use data to its full extent?
Yeah, I think it's crucially important. There are certain roles where you could get away with not being data savvy if you are more in maybe project management. There's a lot of project management involved in what we do, but there are other areas like my role. Absolutely, I definitely need to be able to take a critical eye to data sources like we talked about, take a critical eye to various consultant reports, understand what biases are there, and then drill in and see, are these analyses actually apples to apples? Do they need to be a little bit more reconciled in such a way that we can actually gain some insights from them. So I do that a lot in my day-to-day work. And I think most people in our organization do have to do that as well.
So it sounds like it's a pretty pervasive skill to have if you're in the industry.
Yes, I would say certainly understanding it, like I said, being critical and being able to engage with the data in an intelligent way. I mean, you can crunch numbers in Excel and it's great for complex formulas, but more really doing sanity checks and understanding what you're looking at, being able to reconcile various data sources and piece together what you think is actually going on and getting a coherent story in your head about a market is very important.
Yeah, sounds like it, definitely. And I think it's similar to, again, going back to the finance industry. It's something that the finance industry as a whole is grappling with the same thing, basically trying to get, in their case, it's not necessarily data sources, data integrity that they're struggling with so much as complex analytics. So.
Right. I think for our case, I would just add one thing that might be a little bit different. Definitely part of our industry is that it takes years to build these facilities. I mean, so you're thinking of like, it's going to take at least 4 years to get through the process of developing a facility. So the reliance on data comes in especially when you have to be scouting for sites 4 years before they're going to actually hit the market. So you need to think ahead and actually try to forecast as much as possible. And the smarter forecast you can have, obviously, the better, and the better off your projects are going to be. So in that case, all you can do is look at current and historical data and then try to project forward and try to guess the future to figure out whether you can actually build a facility that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. Try to guesstimate, right? Otherwise, face the consequences. And we've seen that happening too. So you've mentioned a really cool topic, the topic of a black start in renewable energy. Is that something that Recurrent is currently working on, or is it not really related to what you guys are working on?
It can be. It's more of, it kind of circles back to the topic of policy involvement and things like that, and trying to monitor that to understand if we can actually qualify some of our facilities for performing black start. So there's a lot of moving parts there. It's not something that we can necessarily push too hard from our end because there are a lot of stakeholders involved. I do get excited though about the prospect of it happening. And there are a lot of things like that in the energy industry where you have to keep monitoring, you have to keep tracking. Obviously, you want to push for things that you really care about, but kind of monitoring all these potentially fascinating developments and trying to make sure that you can be ready for them. And so in that sense, yes, we are trying to keep ourselves up to speed so that we are able to provide that service if it becomes an option for us.
And the follow-up question to you, if there's anything that you would like to share with us, what's a cool project or initiative that either you've been working on directly or your company's been working on directly that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of tough because most of it's confidential, honestly, in terms of projects. It takes long enough to do these that you have to kind of keep your cards close to your chest. But I will say I do work on the storage team, so I'm totally biased. But I do think what's been interesting for Recurrent and actually for the industry more broadly is that we are seeing storage being more incorporated into the industry. And my company is also very active in terms of storage development. And we're seeing that across the board, storage is starting to make sense in markets where it didn't before. And so California, they've had a duck curve before, and people can Google that if they're not sure what I'm referring to there. But it's definitely made sense to do energy storage in California. And now we're going farther east to be able to implement storage, which is exciting. And it's great to
see. Said a death car?
No, a duck curve. Duck curve, yeah. So that's where it's the shape of the curve that happens if you have a really high penetration of renewables in a market. So what happens?
So it looks like a duck.
Yes, because it looks like a duck. Yes.
Huh. Okay. Yeah. What's going on there? So that's a high penetration of renewables, you said.
Right. So in the absence of storage, and energy in general is an interesting commodity because traditionally it has not had a way to store. Right. If you're in corn, you can store your corn and you can sell it later. Right. That's not an option with energy, or at least it hasn't been until very recently.
Right.
And so, or not on a broad scale. And so in the case of the duck curve, the more solar you have, you see this decline in prices in the middle of the day. What's happening there is that, particularly with solar, if you look at how solar is produced over the course of the day, of course, it's when the sun shines, right? And so you get your maximum output of production from solar facilities in the middle of the day. And when you have some solar penetration, but not a lot, that still works fine. There's not a huge impact. But normally the demand and supply curve might actually be relatively evenly matched. And what happens is when you have an increase in production during those peak hours, then you kind of have this valley. So you end up with this just a mismatch between supply and demand, but there's a lot of energy available from solar facilities and the demand has stayed the same. It is kind of domed. And so then it ends up actually dipping in the middle of the day and creating a duck curve. And then storage, in a lot of cases, if it's a 4-hour battery or even longer, you can store the energy during those times when energy prices are super low, and then you discharge, so you actually let your energy onto the grid at a later time when it's more valuable. And so then you'll see over time, as you increase the amount of storage in a market that has a duck curve, it will alleviate that duck curve and make the market more efficient.
Interesting. Oh, wow. That's definitely it's a concept that I'm going to look up for sure, learn more about.
Yeah.
I love it. Cool. All right. Well, Molly, thank you so much for joining me today. Really interesting to learn a bit more about renewable energy industry. Learn about the renewable energy industry, and something that I know very little about, and I know a bit more about it thanks to you now. So thank you again. And if anyone would like to get in touch with you, where can they find you?
You can certainly find me on LinkedIn. It's kind of the easiest way, and just look up my name, Molly Bales. But yeah, certainly hope the more the merrier when it comes to the renewable energy industry. So I appreciate you spreading the word, spreading the gospel.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks again, Molly. And for everybody watching, thanks for watching us and for watching this episode and our conversation. And if you enjoyed it, please go ahead and give us a like. Subscribe to the channel if this is the kind of thing that you'd like to see more of. And thanks for joining us. I'm Claudia Virlanuta. This is my guest, Molly Bales, and we'll see you next time.